In this SY2 screencast, we're going to take a look at observational methods in sociological research. So in the last screencast, we looked at the use of experiments in sociological research, and we noted that that's very much a minority method in sociology. When it comes to the gathering of primary data, much more common is either observational research or asking questions, so the use of questionnaires or different types of interviews. And in this screencast, we're going to focus on observational methods. Now, there are two main ways in which we do observational research in sociology. Firstly, there's what we call non-participant observation or direct observation. And in this particular case, the researcher is exclusively an observer. So they're not actually taking part in the group's activities. They are simply observing that group from a distance. Whereas in the case of participant observation, the researcher is trying to find out about the way of life of a group of people by joining that group. So they participate in the daily activities of that group. They observe what that group says and does from within. In other words, participant observation allows the sociologist to experience social life from the perspective of the group being studied. Now, both types of observational research, so both non-participant and participant observation, can either be conducted in an overt fashion or a covert fashion. So in the case of overt observational research, both the identity of the researcher and something of the nature of the research will be known to the subjects of that research. So it's being done with the full knowledge and consent of the group being studied. Whereas covert observational research is a situation where the subjects do not know that they're being observed or do not know the true purpose of the research. So it's more what we would call undercover observational research. And in class we'll look at a really interesting case study that involved a researcher secretly infiltrating a very dangerous group, the football hooligan firm associated with Chelsea Football Club, the Headhunters. So the example that we'll look at in class is an example of covert participant observation, which is often the only practical way of studying criminal and deviant groups. Now, one of the founding fathers of sociology as an academic discipline was Max Weber. Weber argued that the goal of doing sociology was to achieve something called Verstehen. Now, Verstehen is a German word that literally means to understand. But what Weber meant by this concept was the ability to put oneself in the shoes of another person in order to appreciate their particular experiences and perspectives. So Verstehen is this practice of empathy, the ability to see the world through the eyes of the people that we're trying to understand. And I think out of all of the methods that we look at in sociology, the best method for achieving Verstehen is participant observation, because you are literally putting yourself in the shoes of the group that you're trying to understand. Now, participant observation is associated with a particular type of research design known as ethnography. And ethnography is a research design that was actually pioneered within sociology's sister subject, social anthropology. And social anthropologists are interested in traditional societies, in pre-industrial societies such as tribal societies. And the argument that social anthropologists have made is that if you really want to understand these very different cultures, you have to immerse yourself in that particular group. You have to become a participant observer so that you can understand that culture on its own terms. And this is a style of research that has become increasingly popular in sociology. And you might remember a couple of screencasts ago, we talked about the debates in sociology about the best way of producing valid knowledge. And we talked about a positivist approach to doing research, where sociology is modelled on the natural sciences. And we also talked about interpretivism, an approach to doing research where we're trying to understand groups using qualitative research methods. We're trying to understand how groups interpret and make sense of reality. And I think participant observation, out of all of the methods in sociology, is the closest in spirit to an interpretivist approach. So unlike experimental approaches, in participant observation, we're not manipulating an aspect of the participant's environment. We are trying to observe behaviour as it naturally occurs in a genuine social context without any interference. And whereas in experiments the idea is that the sociologist is like a scientist, a detached, neutral observer, obviously in participant observation we're immersing ourselves in the group. We're trying to become part of the group in order to achieve this idea of Verstehen that Weber talked about. So experiments are linked to the positivist tradition, whereas participant observation is linked to the interpretivist tradition. And participant observation has some real strengths as a research method. It's potentially very high in validity because you're seeing behaviour in its natural context, because you get a depth and context that you wouldn't get from other methods. Arguably, this produces the most true-to-life data of any method in sociology. Also, it helps you achieve empathy. So going back to this idea of Verstehen, this is the method that is probably the best in helping us understand the world from the perspective of the group that's being studied. Also, unlike interviews or questionnaires, we can study social interaction, including non-verbal interaction. And also this is a method that gives sociologists a great deal of flexibility and innovation. And I'll explain that point a little bit later on when we look at an example study. But there are some big practical problems with doing participant observation research. One of the most difficult and time-consuming issues is actually getting access to the group in the first place, getting into the group. And the video that we'll look at in class on covert participant observation of football hooliganism will illustrate many of those practical issues. It can also be difficult actually staying in the group, particularly if you're adopting a covert role, and sometimes it can be difficult leaving the group. It's not easy to simply stop participating in a group that you're personally involved with. And despite the depth and detail that you get from participant observation research, it is a method that attracts some criticism. So some researchers would argue that it's low in reliability, that it's an unstructured method that can never really be repeated. Also, if you're doing overt participant observation, there's what we've called the Hawthorne effect. That's where people's behaviour might change if they know that they're being observed. There are also problems of representativeness with this method. So although you've got depth and detail, you're probably only looking at a small group, and that small group may not be representative of a wider population. Also, the data that you get is not standardised, it's difficult to quantify research, and practically, out of all of the methods really in sociology, this is the one that's the hardest work. It's the most time-consuming and probably the most labour-intensive method in sociology. And just going back to the issue of overt and covert observational research, remember, overt observational research is where the group know that they're being observed and they understand something about the purpose of the research, whereas covert observation, they're unaware that their behaviour is being observed, or they might not know the true purpose of the research. Now there's an ethical issue here if you do covert research, because covert research obviously doesn't have the informed consent of the group that you're researching. But of course if you do overt research, although that's ethical, that detracts from the aim of the research. If you're doing participant observation, it's because you want to see behaviour as it naturally occurs. And of course the danger is that if you tell people that you're observing their behaviour, they cease to behave in a way which is natural. Now in the exam, when you're talking about a particular research method, you have to illustrate the strengths and weaknesses with examples of real research. And we'll look at examples of real research in class. But I just want to mention a couple of really famous studies. This study is very interesting. Okay, this is a study called Black Like Me by John Howard Griffin, and this study shows the extraordinary lengths that sociologists will go to when they're trying to observe a particular group. So John Howard Griffin was a white man who in 1959 used medication and sun lamp treatments to change his skin colour and pass as a black American, because in this piece of research he was trying to experience racism from the perspective of black Americans. So extraordinary lengths that John Howard Griffin went to in order to become a participant observer. And I mentioned earlier in the screencast that one of the advantages of participant observation over, let's say, interviews or questionnaires is it gives you flexibility. And this, I think, is perfectly illustrated by this very famous study of an Italian street corner gang in Boston in America. And the researcher, William White, spent 3.5 years in this particular gang as a participant observer. And what he says in this study is, as I sat and listened, I learned the answers to questions I would not have had the sense to have asked. And that shows one of the strengths of participant observation, the flexibility to focus on issues that you wouldn't have thought of asking if you were using a questionnaire or an interview schedule. Now, most observational research in sociology has been of the participant variety that clearly fits with the interpretivist tradition. However, I am going to briefly mention non-participant observation. And non-participant observation is often much more structured than participant observation research. So in a structured non-participant observation, the researcher observes behaviour as an outsider, and the researcher may have a tally chart of behaviour that they're looking for. So they'll mark down each type of behaviour as it occurs. So, for example, a researcher may go into a classroom to study the differences in behaviour between girls and boys, and the researcher may have categories like how often and for how long boys and girls talk, how much time the teacher gives to boys and girls. So in the case of structured non-participant observation, there's the potential to make it more scientific and more positivistic. So one of the key advantages of non-participant observation is you can be more detached and neutral if you're observing the group from a distance. Whereas with participant observation, there's always the danger that you can get too involved in the group. And when that happens, we talk about the sociologist going native. And the other thing about non-participant observation, if it's very structured, that can enable measurement, and that can make observational research repeatable. It can improve the reliability of the method. But the disadvantages of doing non-participant observation is you might not really get to understand the group through the eyes of the people that you're researching, that you might need to experience what it's like to be part of the group if you really want to get a valid insight. And the other disadvantage with non-participant observation is if people know that they're being watched, if there's an observer there observing them with their checklist, then of course you've got the Hawthorne effect again.